podcast's gonna start. You're gonna be considerate and shit. Yeah,
See,
that's
countdown. There's a
yeah, well, yeah.
countdown.
Now you do. Usually we're like hanging out, we're just talking shit. I'm saying something completely inappropriate, and then the man
Katie,
just
Katie,
starts.
Katie saw the countdown. She knows what's
Yeah,
up.
she
Good
knows.
morning, everyone. This is episode 39 of the Three Buddy Problem. We're four buddies with no problems this week. Welcome to Katie Moussouris, CEO of Luta Security. Katie, how are you, my friend?
I'm doing great. How are you all doing? And I really feel like this podcast should be called Three Buddies and a Buddy when you have a guest. And I'm
You're
just
it.
the extra buddy.
It is
I
what
didn't.
you say it is. Welcome to the show, and thank you for listening. Thank you for promoting and participating in some of the social media conversations. Let me start with you right now. How is Luta Security doing? Tell me what's going on over there.
No, we're doing great. We just celebrated our 9-year anniversary, which I find completely
Wow.
surreal. I feel like the pandemic kind of shrank all of our life forces a little bit, but it also just abbreviated time. I mean, I feel like there
9
was 5
years.
years in there, and I don't know where they went. So 9 years, 9 years of Luta Security.
I
Doing
think that's
well, trudging
amazing.
along.
Yeah.
Sorry, Ryan, to like jump in there. Like, I think it's amazing just because I remember when you were starting the company. Like, and look, I was very early in my career at the time, and you just like pulled it out of nowhere. Like, I'm starting my own thing, and I was like, why would you do that? I mean, this seems maybe like I guess she wants to try it. Like, let's see what happens. And like next thing I know, it was like you guys are like immensely successful. Like you've built something legit, and it's just funny to me. I just remember us like hanging out at RSA maybe like 9 years ago, and just being like, "Hey, Katie's starting her own thing. Like, let's see."
Good.
And I remember so many people were like, "Oh, so, it's just you?" And I was like, "Well, it's me for right this second, but no, we built something, we've grown and we did it all without VC, which I don't know of too many other companies in general who have done that.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. It's not like we wouldn't have taken their money. We absolutely would have taken their money, but nobody was interested in funding us. So, oh well, that's fine. We just, kept growing, and unlike others in our space, we had to be profitable. So we actually know how to run a business. It's crazy. It's
Awesome.
nuts.
Shout out to my buddy Jen Wood over there, also working on the
Oh my
Luta
God.
on the Luta train. Costin in Bucharest, Romania, very quiet this morning. What's up, buddy?
Oh, it's good. I'm just happy to hear from friends. Also, shout out to Jen Wood, if it's the same Jen Wood that I
It
think
is. It is.
It is.
Wow. Time
She
flies.
celebrated her 5-year anniversary working with Luta Security. Talk about how, I mean, she's one of the legends in the industry herself. And the fact that I've been privileged enough to work with her directly for this long is amazing.
Absolutely.
For the listeners who don't know all this inside baseball, Jen Wood used to work with the Three Buddies, doing like a lot of the heavy lifting PR work, and then now we see her over at yet another sister company. So it's a nice small clicky
Small
little
world.
circle. For the 60 people that are listening, we're sorry for like kind of pigeonholing in there.
Let's pivot quickly to the news this week. On this show, we have at length talked about the absence of or poor quality of APT research reports, just general threat intelligence work coming out of China, specifically Chinese private sector companies. Things changed this week. Pretty significant happening where we got an official government document from the MSS outing for alleged members of Taiwan's, what they call electronic Information Communications and Electronics Force Command. Alongside that, we had two separate adjoining reports from Anti and another Chinese companies kind of documenting this thing, very specifically targeting Taiwanese APTs down to the names and stuff. Costin, impressive work here. This is the kind of thing we've been asking for. What do you make of what we've seen here?
Well, I think this was coming, and we kind of expected this to happen for a very long time. So now that it's out, we can say that finally it's happening. What is interesting here, it's always interesting to see this coordination between the government and the public sector, which may or may not be obvious in the first place. But when something like this happens, and of course we've seen in the past similar cases when the government publishes something and then private companies very quickly come and supplement the release with their own technical details, and that they couldn't have done that on spot. They got some kind of an advance warning. So I think this is also the case here.
It's no
And
different from what we do here in the West either when we see Symantec and Microsoft going alongside, say, an FBI report, right?
Sure, it's similar. And what I thought was also interesting, that apparently it wasn't just Anti and Qianxin, but there were more reports. We just kind of missed them because I believe that most, if not all of them, were in Chinese. So we came by, for instance, another report from something called the Cybersecurity Vocational Training School from Wuhan Nedun Technology, which published a report, in my opinion, that is longer and even better than the other two, with the mention that the other two, one of them has like obfuscated IOCs, like the like with the stars and the obfuscated child, which is terrible in my opinion. Like when you do this kind of things, at least you like do it full, like
well,
full,
it doesn't
full
make
disclosure.
any sense, right? Like the
No.
whole point of it being like, oh, we're doing this for defense. We're like, okay, and then you go look at it, it's like the IOCs aren't there. You're like,
Yeah.
okay,
Why?
yeah, it's like what are we defending with?
Do you guys see anything at all nerve-wracking about naming the APT, the identities of people on the back end of it? Because we've done it in the US here. I mean,
we do it to them all the time, and that's what we've been talking about, where I'm like, look, this all seems real cool because they haven't pulled that shit off with us yet, but I feel like the day they push a blog where it's like, here's 5 Booz Allen contractors, we're gonna lose our fucking minds.
Kitty, is that something you feel like people here should be paying attention to, especially people doing this kind of security research to find your picture and your face popped up in an APT thing out of China? If you're an American researcher or someone in the UK like doing this kind of thing, is that something you recommend people pay attention to?
No, now one, you're breaking rule number 1.
I know.
Where I said, don't call on me. I will tell you.
This is what he does to us. This is what he does to us.
Seriously. So I did actually have something to say on this. So, forget your question for a second, Costin, when you were saying the bit about they had advanced warning. I would posit that it wasn't advanced warning necessarily. Like warning is probably the wrong word. It's that they were working together the entire time, the government and these private sector companies. That's what we do. And then they got a coordinated release date where they were, permitted to then go forward with their information. And that's really how I expect them to have done it. That's how we do it over here. But yeah, back to your question where you put me on the spot, Ryan. No, I mean, I think it's gonna be rough when we start having our individual contractors, wherever they work over here in the West getting named. I think there's a reason why the US does it, in terms of persons of interest, and naming people that they end up putting on sanction lists. So there's going to be some naming on the US side just based on the fact that we have that sanction mechanism that we do. And then we've attempted, prosecutions in that area as well, as you know. So I would be interested to see if it doesn't just cross over into naming Western folks who are operators, but into attempted prosecutions as well.
What do you guys make of the quality of the report? I mean, we've talked in the past about Chinese kind of hodgepodge things from different places and so on. The Anti thing and the Qianxin report and some of the others you mentioned, Costin. Is it appropriate quality in terms of what we'd expect from APT research team?
I would say the quality is very similar to the kind of things we've seen in the past from Chinese companies, in the sense that, and I'm not entirely sure if this is a language thingy or maybe a translation issue, but they're definitely not structured the same way that we structure our reports. And I guess that a lot of the lessons and the style of the reports that we have been doing, it comes mostly from the Western School of Intelligence, like CIA manuals and different intelligence best practices. So, like, again, it's not a surprise. What was interesting for me in these reports, most of them, well, I guess it's mostly about the malware they were using and like the methodology and how these attacks look like, which is quite similar to your typical average Chinese APT looks like, which is probably why maybe over so many years people didn't differentiate between these, like didn't necessarily assume that this was China or Taiwan or whatever, but they were all pretty much in the same bucket because they look similar all the way down to the malware they were using. So for instance, in this case, they were using poison ivy, like that's the same as hundreds of other Chinese groups and subgroups. ZX shell, the same. XRAT, HTTP bot, Ghost, Trojan, and so on. So to me, this was like, I don't know if it's cultural or maybe is it like because they were just trying to blend in and mimic the attackers, which could be a possibility here. But that was an interesting detail to me, how well it looked like your average Chinese APT activity.
China, Taiwan is kind of feels like it's on the edge with all the warlike activity around the world. Everyone is kind of paying attention to what's happening in China, Taiwan, with like all kinds of speculation of who or what or when it happens. Does this signal to any of you that things are ramping up in a certain nervous direction?
I think that's been an expectation for some time that things are ramping up, but I think we've been saying that they're ramping up and they're ramping up and they're ramping up, and people keep saying like, "Oh, this is going to happen." There were folks who would cite, I think, a very specific date. I can't remember what it was. It was like August 2026 or something. I don't know. I can't remember, and MJ is going to kill me for that. But what I'll say is, I don't know what the ramp up is
The
supposed.
coordinated nature of it.
No,
the
I
first time we
get
were
it,
seeing this, yeah.
but it has been coordinated for a long time, and it has been, sorry, just like talking about like China-Taiwan relations in general, right? Like this has been ramping up for a while. I think that there was a recognition in Gov, not just with this administration, but towards the tail end of the last one, where suddenly people started to get kind of like a little more honest and a little more like, yeah, just honest of saying, hey, you know what? We are very unlikely to do anything to support Taiwan if an invasion does happen. Like that's a posture that we've taken for a long time, but it's always felt like a very hollow one, especially after like we just watched them take over Hong Kong and like we're like, well, whatever. And now like, we have our hands tied, like we're a bit busy with with supporting Ukraine at least. And then Israel Hamas, and then you're telling me like, oh yeah, we're gonna go to the other side of the world to fight for a nation that, like, forgive me, but like most Americans don't even remember or know why there's any conflict between Taiwan and China. Like they may as well just, forgive us, but like that is the level of ignorance that we normally live with here. And it makes it very hard to make a compelling case for it. The truth here is like on the US side, we care about Taiwan primarily because of TSMC. Like
Yeah.
that's why that was the whole subtext of the CHIPS Act. Like if they could have teleported all of TSMC like directly to Arizona, the Chinese could have picked up Taiwan the next day. It would have been like, whatever, right? So it kind of puts you in this sort of weird situation where I think people are getting more honest about it. And it is interesting to see threat intel now being used as part of what is a continual, multi-pronged, coordinated strategy of just normalizing the idea that Taiwan is part of mainland China, right? Like that's why that expression throughout all the reports, they're spying on mainland China. They're abusing the taxes of the Taiwanese to spy on their own brethren. And there's no need for that because Taiwanese independence is a delusion, is literally like what it says in this thing. You're like, okay, slightly different tone to the threat intel reports we get, slightly different tone to what you get out of an FBI indictment, but we'll roll with it. Why not, right?
Well, I think there's also another component in that, in terms of us getting into something to try and defend Taiwan, we have something out there to lose. And I will tell you, I have family out there in the Mariana Islands, and that is not a very defensible outpost right now. It's underdefended for its strategic value to the United States. And it's definitely something that I would see as, going off the board in terms of coming after something of ours that is the furthest out that we have in the Pacific. It's of exceeding strategic value to us to have that, as essentially a way station to leverage, any kind of physical, attacks in that direction. So
Right.
losing it would be a big problem. And like I said, it's critically underdefended for its strategic significance. I don't think we'd be willing to give up that outpost. And I for one, being half native Chamorro, do not want to see another change of hands in the colonization of my people's native land.
Right.
So
I mentioned that when Volt Typhoon was first discovered and documented, we talked about critical infrastructure places in Guam that was originally infected.
You beat me to it. That's what
Mhm.
that was exactly where I was going to jump in and be like, I mean, you're absolutely right, Katie, and I don't think we'd be comfortable, but if we are equating cyber as somehow of like critical importance in this tit for tat, like we already got shoved when if you believe all of the, and I say if you believe because this was all like unofficial reporting through, I think the Wall Street Journal or Washington Post or whomever, who came out and said basically, oh yeah, this Volt Typhoon thing, it's about like them having hit like in sort of preparation, sort of
Preparing, yeah.
prepositioning
Prepositioning, yes.
in Guam when it comes to like critical infrastructure and like logistics and whatever. And people lost their shit, but nobody did anything. Like they really didn't do much of anything. Like I think there were some like, I would imagine, I believe, CNMF folks like came out to like support some of the Gov folks. But I'll tell you, like we as Sentinel-1 like personally stepped in just to like do some pro bono deployments and stuff with critical infrastructure. And you're like, guys, like they were literally like, oh, thank you. Like we have gotten like no offers of support, no software, no money. Like honestly, it's a fairly unfunded mandate to say, defend yourself, island. And like their politicians, like rightly so, said, there's people here who don't have like clean running water. No, we're not spending our money like buying EDR software, which is a fairly reasonable thing to say.
yeah, I mean, you're talking about defense against Volt Typhoon. There's been not inadequate response to actual typhoons, right, in the island. So I am not surprised in the least.
No
Volt
typhoons
Probably
are
the
being
government
responded
officials you
to.
were talking to were my cousins. I just want you to know that.
Oh, fair.
I
Got
mean,
it.
definitely my cousins.
Just drop Tom Hagel's name. He's the one, he's the one doing miracles out.
I will mention him when I go back this summer.
I think this coordinated nature of China and private sector things will become pretty much the norm moving forward, and I think it's a signal of something. I don't know what it means, but I think it's something that it's worth discussing and folks watching. I want to pivot quickly.
It's interesting that I think they're probably seeing this as some kind of an experiment just to see how it goes, because I guess they've been planning this for a very long time, for the moment when they do some big indictment of foreign hackers. So maybe start small, collect feedback, see how it was received, who wrote about it, who covered it, and so on, and then just prepare the next one, like if the feedback was positive. Like given the typical cycle, I would expect the next one to come maybe in the late 2025, something like that. So maybe in about 6 months we're gonna see the next big release.
Yeah,
Maybe either it would be, I think, Ocean Lotus, like again another small thingy, which is, by the way, mentioned a bit throughout these reports as being like one of the top issues for them, or of course one of the big ones.
I think it's fascinating how balkanized all of this has become. Americans reporting on external threats, Russians reporting only on Ukrainian things, Chinese reporting only on Taiwanese things, and these are the little boxes out of which we'll get research reports, and it doesn't feel like it's pure anymore.
Ethics and perils of APT research was 2015.
And
We
here we
talked
are.
about it. We talked about the balkanization of this shit. We talked about how, like, right now, TI, because it was part of marketing, it had been decontextualized from what intelligence is supposed to be. And it was easygoing because we really didn't have those hot conflicts. You really didn't have any, like, sense of, like, there is this sort of, like, falsity introduced by the success of the internet and Web 2.0 and whatever, which was that notion of like, it was like Bretton Woods in cyber. Like it was, oh, it's all about globalization. And like our biggest problems were discussing how like American hegemonical cyber, like internet companies were having a hard time operating in the Chinese ecosystem. Like that was our biggest problem as far as the internet was concerned. And the second shit gets real in the real world, you suddenly see that this like membrane of everything cyber as a domain no longer makes a whole lot of sense. Like people were just doing things for the lulz and for the research value. And like we were some of the first ones, like with some of the central folks doing that shit. But it was a special pocket of time where we could pretend that that intelligence production was somehow not patriotic. It didn't need to be patriotically aligned. It didn't need to give a fuck about like the balance and who you're supporting and who you're helping. And I mean,
That's gone
it's
away.
gone,
We're now
man.
getting these little boxes. Yeah.
Well, it's gone in the sense that forgiving space is no longer as forgiving. Like I think you can try to do it, but you do need to explain yourself. Whereas before you didn't. We were like, look, it's malware's malware, and we're all just doing our jobs, and like, we get paid to defend people. Now you do have to, like, you can keep quiet, but there's an asterisk that just like immediately pops up on whatever it is you said, where they go, the fuck are you playing at? And
Yeah.
it's really interesting. Like with Kaspersky, I think you could argue back and forth as to whether all of the Kaspersky claims were valid or substantiated or whatever. But the minute they stopped like publishing on Russian threats and then started publishing on Ukrainian threats all the time, you're like,
Exactly.
okay, right? Like you
Let me-
you drew the lines.
Well,
Let me
and
put-
I mean, to an extent, how can you blame all of these companies worldwide for, one, adhering to whatever, laws and norms are expected of them by their home government, right? Like that is something that they can't really escape. They can't rehome themselves
Right.
somewhere
Well,
else.
Yandex did, but yes.
But I mean, generally speaking, we don't have corporations as claiming refugee status and going and applying for asylum somewhere else, so they
Right.
have to
True.
continue. And I think that's really the other thing too that I've seen emerging in deeper government requirements for all things cyber. So it's not just on the research end of things, we're seeing it on the vuln disclosure end of things. We're seeing, things where more and more governments are requiring vulnerability reporting directly to them within a certain time period and all that stuff. That wave is catching on to our, honestly, to our great detriment worldwide. But we're just seeing all of this increased control exercised by home governments on their domestic corporations.
Right, and the hypocrisy of us sitting here saying, "Hey, they're doing this." Like we have publications and private companies here in the U.S. that call U.S.-based operations friendlies. I mean, like, why is it friendlies here and not there?
I don't object to them doing this. I think it's an interesting development. I think it's an interesting development, particularly because it hadn't been happening, and now it is happening, right? Like it's not so much that like at the end of the day in Russia, you can look at like Positive Technologies and Kaspersky and whatever suddenly ramping up the Ukrainian thing, but they were already publishing TI reports in general, right? Like this is obviously a coordinated effort. That doesn't, we coordinate efforts as well. But it's interesting that it's a coordinated effort, so centrally coordinated, and they have decided that this is the time and there's a need for it and that they think it's like a valuable thing to do. That is a change in posture. Instead of like all this bullshit about like, oh, are they ramping up? Are they not? You're like, well, here they're starting to do new important things that they weren't willing to do before. Why? Right? Like those are things that are worth discussing.
All right, let me pivot to CitizenLab. CitizenLab's new report on Paragon spyware. Paragon, I'd remind you, is the company created out of Israel, created by Ehud Barak, that was actually sold to an American company. So it's now an American private sector offensive actor slash spyware companies. CitizenLab put out a new report, and documented in there is WhatsApp zero click. That WhatsApp discovered and mitigated after finding it as an active Paragon thing. Who read the report? Can you guys jump in here and tell me what's significant about
Bro,
this?
who read the
read it.
report?
We eat
I
it.
I listen.
We absorb it.
Waiting for this podcast. I just need your listeners to know there was literally 27 hours of reading that I didn't get through. So,
Well,
but
speaking
seriously,
of, Katie, like this, I'm sorry, I listened to this shit at 3.5x, and this report took me 34 minutes to read. Still,
Why?
at that speed. It's so long for something that has so few IOCs.
That's why I asked who read the report. I wanted to see who was going to lie.
I read the report.
Thank God.
The reason I read it is because I was scooping for IOCs and other things through the report. Like when I realized there's no IOC section at the end, I said, "Oh damn! I know it means that I have to read everything," which I did actually. And I thought it was a kind of an interesting. It's an interesting difference, and especially it's interesting to notice what a big difference there is between the reports that CitizenLab releases and the ones that, as you were saying, your government coordinates with threat intelligence companies. Big difference. While, let's say, typically threat intelligence companies, they just want to burn things, same for the government, right? Like just expose whatever you know, burn the infrastructure, burn those guys. This report here from CitizenLab, it feels more like a chess game. In the sense that they found something, but they're not releasing their entire methodology, only some fine points, in the hope that the attackers will change their operations or change their TTPs, and they seem to be able to watch all that and prepare the next move. Setting traps, if you want, correct. So that was my feeling from reading this report and reading through the lines. Yeah, of course, there's 4 signatures that you can run on Census IO if you have a pro account to find some infrastructure, but even that doesn't give you a lot. And what it gives you mostly is IP addresses. There's no file system artifacts or log artifacts that you can extract from the phone and then check with things like MVT to see if your phone has been targeted. So I thought that was an interesting aspect about the report.
Well, I'm glad the cat showed up again, Jack, because when Costin said scooping for IOCs, I immediately went to kitty litter. That is exactly where my mind went. No, but
that's what these IOCs are these days.
Yeah, right, exactly. You're looking for these nuggets.
No.
Yep, it's true. But Jax, you were going to say something. I just had to interject because your cat showed up too.
Oh no, I mean he's a for folks who don't watch the videos, like you don't realize that this cat has been a part of pretty much every episode, at least that have been filmed in my house. No, I think this is really interesting. I agree with you, Costin, that like there's something kind of fascinating to the tit for tat and chess game and strategizing that we're seeing from CitizenLab folks. And like I made joke about the lack of IOCs and kind of be snide about whatever they do with their visibility and whether they share, they don't share, they don't share samples, whatever. But like what I will say is they are in the harder part of the detection space, in the hardest part of the research space, primarily because you're fighting this mega giant company, Apple, who does not really, really want us to actually see what's happening. And that is like the added layer of fucking difficulty that that we simply do not have when it comes to any of this other like attempting to follow cyber espionage. Like when all the work we're doing on Windows and Mac or whatever, like on Windows and Android, a couple other places, like the difficulty is what the adversary is doing to hide. On iOS, the added difficulty is the mega corporation who is the regent of that platform that does not want you playing along at home either. So I think I kind of understand how CitizenLab is figuring this shit out, because Costin and I were at PivotCon last year, and there was a very interesting TLP Red talk about some of the mechanisms they can use to source some of this data on an infrastructure level. And frankly, normally I might be upset that they're not like putting their findings out in the public record in full, but considering that they have to fight this like guerrilla style warfare to even find samples and shit, touche, man. Like, well done. Hold on to your secrets. Maybe share some samples in IOCs like privately, please. But good on you for doing the job, right?
And shout out to the WhatsApp team as well. I feel like the WhatsApp team is pretty aggressive compared to all the other folks about protecting their own infrastructure.
Yeah, I mean, they're the ballsier ones there.
I think the thing that you were saying about Apple, controlling a lot of the information, that has been a winning strategy for them commercially. That is absolutely, that's been deliberate, and from all the way back. I mean, I haven't worked at Microsoft in over a decade at this point, but back then, it was really interesting to see the differences in the strategies of the two companies when I was inside one of them. Microsoft was aiming for more transparency. They've ebbed and flowed in that arena, but you could definitely say that they tend towards much more transparency than Apple, and they always have. And Apple pretty much learned from that as being a big mistake commercially, right? It was like talking about all of the things.
Transparency being the mistake?
Well, yeah, Apple saw that as a big commercial mistake because effectively it got it into the heads of everybody that Microsoft has all these security problems because they were always talking about security. Whereas Apple, pretty much kept their mouth shut. It's like saying, here are all the things we're doing to prevent cholera from getting into your drinking water, but all the users here is cholera. And so, I mean, really, Apple has kept to the collective consciousness blissfully unaware of a lot of their security underpinnings, and this is part of their strategy, and it has been for over a decade, and they've used it effectively commercially. And that's what I think, the commercial reality here is that they have no incentive to change. So we're just going to have to work around, like we always have, in their lack of transparency, because it's not commercially, there's no reason for them to wade into the security transparency world of cholera, talking about cholera all the time.
I think this might be one of the few areas where I do think the only way we'll get some real traction is going to be through regulation, and primarily the EU. And I'm mostly thinking about France here. Like the whole Pegasus scandal in France created a very motivated, powerful government in Europe that actually has a vested interest in fighting I mean, all of them do, but this one has like a clear vendetta in like going at the ability to inspect for iOS security and whatnot. I mean, having your president and everybody else popped with a commercial platform, they changed their tune. I'll say they seem a lot more invested in it. And my hope here is that that's going to translate into some actual initiatives in the EU, because that is one of the few markets that leans into regulating, and people give a shit because it's a big enough market to care, and they know that they're kind of, at least they're paying lip service to it, so they're going to find a way to charge you some money for it.
So we like regulation in this place, but not when it's costing cork hanging on his bottle. I just want to remind the audience
you guys to finally say thank you to the European Union. Have you said thank you once to the European Union?
Mr. America, go ahead. Say thank you once.
You know what? We're a more isolationist podcast these days. We're just gonna let the Europeans fend for themselves.
I'll remind the audience that Apple had a lawsuit going against the NSO group and withdrew that lawsuit because God knows what, with some bogus explanation. And WhatsApp is the only kind of Meta, and WhatsApp is the only private company we see at least aggressively trying to publicly do some outing and so on. If that goes away, if Zuck plays the game that he's playing now and WhatsApp gets pulled away from that, I suspect that a lot of these disclosures will be left up to just the CitizenLab folks, and it might just be minuscule old 17.2 things, and what's happening on iOS 18.3 or whatever today might be lost on it. So again, shout out to the WhatsApp guys there.
Don't
By the way,
we think that the lawsuit withdrawal was because they didn't want things coming out in Discovery?
Discovery, yeah.
Don't you,
Right.
when you file a lawsuit, don't you know that discovery is like the very first thing that happens? Like, what is
Right.
this bogus excuse?
And they weren't going to be able to essentially protect all of these trade secrets. I do have to say that every single time as a listener that I have heard a reference to Mr. America, I have in my mind sang this song, and this has become the very first musical episode of Three Buddies and a Buddy.
Oh, thank God! Here we go.
There he is, Mr. America. I needed you all to have that as part of your earworm now too. Now every time you hear this Mr. America reference, you will hear the song. You will hear me singing it.
I need to come out in like an America, like tank top and flag in hand.
like the
ideally.
Homelander from The Boys.
Yeah, exactly.
Where's the blanket? Get the blanket.
I
Get the
need to
blanket.
go. I'll go get the blanket.
No, and
I had a point. I was gonna make a point, but let Katie speak, and I'll grab.
No,
it.
I mean that's the thing though. Everything is a musical in my mind, and I just let you in on it for this one little piece of my soundtrack. So there you have a piece of my internal soundtrack that's running all the time.
Speaking of Mr. America and balkanization, the next story on our list is this Operation Zero Twitter account looking for Telegram one-click and O-click remote code execution.
Ryan, before we move on, I thought there was something special about this CitizenLab report, which makes it a bit different from the previous ones. I don't know if you guys see it the same way, so I'd be like super interested to hear what you think. But do you think they'll get in trouble because they outed the Canadian police operations?
I saw that.
Did you saw that? And the fact that they give indication about IP ranges used by the Canadian police, and again, CitizenLab is in Canada. Do you guys think they'll get in trouble for this?
Look, they may not get in trouble, but if they're, mysterious hoof marks on their heads at some point in time, you'll know who did it. You know who did it.
I think that's I think they want to know. So that's one thing I'll say about not being in the corporate side of things, right? Like for us, it's inevitable that you have a conversation about the viability of your business. If you're not an idiot, right? Like you're gonna have to have a strategic discussion about the value of fucking with your home turf when you are a business. They are not a business. They do live off of their reputation, and in a sense, that is their only safety, is their reputation and visibility and like high profileness. Speaking of CitizenLab. And I think contrary to what a company would do, they do want to know, and they do want to kind of push that button. And I'm speaking for them, and frankly, like Bill and Ron, like it's not my place to speak to their motivations. I don't fucking know, but I'm saying, like, as far as incentives go, you do kind of have, like, if you figure out that the fucking the call's coming from inside the house, like your neighborhood is like that's where this shit is going down. You absolutely want to push that button and say, okay, either we have an honest discussion here and you guys want to tell us that you're like playing ball in like a nice way. Like you can say, hey, look, there's a bunch of meth labs in Ontario that we're trying to figure out, right? Like, unless you want to have that conversation, which is what you're supposed to do in a democracy and blah, 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 then great. And if they're not willing to, or if they're gonna push back, or if they're gonna go all jackboot, okay, let's see that shit here where it matters with an organization that everyone respects specifically for this thing. Like, it's almost too good to pass up.
Shouldn't we be okay with our police departments having access to this thing?
Not only that, but
American, I would say no.
well,
No.
like just to give you another and sorry to interrupt you, but just wanted to add a bit of more substance to the question that Ryan asked, which was um, considering that WhatsApp and Apple notify the victims, right? And assuming that the Canadian police, Canadians are the nicest of people, like that I know. I've been to Canada many times. I love them. Maybe like everything they're doing is super legit, and they were investigating some really bad drug dealers or whatever extremists, and all those guys, they got the notification, hey, you have some spyware on your phone, go clean it up and protect yourself. Is that not messing up with the police investigation? Like,
So
how do you see that?
I think this is important, and I think this is actually the kind of conversation that can advance this topic in a meaningful way, which is to say that the premise of Citizen Lab's research explicitly is that the power given by these mercenary, lawful intercept companies, even to democracies, is it's too great in its corrupting influence, right? It's the fucking, it's the one ring, right? Like you hand it to somebody as pure as you might hope, and because of the ability to do what they do in complete covertness, with Apple literally like keeping people away from being able to see what they're doing, that people will just become corrupted by it. There is a discussion to be had about the fact that like that doesn't need to be the case, but the problem here is actually the lack of transparency. And I think that this is where law enforcement has made a big mistake in trying to be like the spooks, trying to be like the actual intelligence community in hiding their sources and methods to this degree. And I say that because I'm curious how often law enforcement has had great collection that they could have leveraged in a court case, and they didn't because they're trying to keep this shit such a level of, secret as the IC would. Whereas if you wanted to bring legitimacy to this as a collection mechanism for law enforcement, it actually would benefit from a level of radical transparency and like almost like a mechanistic approach to maintaining forensic integrity, because that's what you would normally expect of evidentiary standards when it comes to something that's going to go to court, something that has to do with law enforcement. Normally, they would show up with like a disk image and the memory dump. Everything has a hash. There's a forensic chain of custody of this person took this thing, gave this thing, put it here. This is how we got this disk image. And then somebody would have to do a full analysis, like, this is how we got this. This is what we saw. This is the hash of this. This is what the file name is. And that's why this person, like, this is why we're saying this person was collecting child porn. That is normally the evidentiary standard of something that goes to law enforcement. When it comes to this, like, the issue with law enforcement wanting to play like intel gatherers in this way and doing it the same way that the IC does is that they're taking away from the legitimacy that they normally would imbue in a court case about something that is, like a legitimate law enforcement action. The whole point is that at some point it's going to go to court. And I don't think supporting the extreme covertness of these collection mechanisms is something that strengthens their argument.
I think your Mr. America has a point.
And if you're watching,
I'm
this,
so glad we brought a fourth buddy that can finally appreciate my input.
No, but I think you're also looking at law enforcement in this context as more of a monolith than it really is. In actuality, law enforcement is regionalized. Much
Right.
like, we kind of look at different governments and their behaviors and their use of these tools, and we will categorize them. We'll say, well, this government uses their tools on, political dissidents, and we don't like that, right?
Right.
Well, it's fractional in terms of the use cases and who gets targeted in individual law enforcement jurisdictions. So when you're looking at it from the IC government level down to law enforcement, the law enforcement layer is not a monolith, and they will not all act accordingly. So I take your point about it being for, gathering it for a court case, but it's who is targeted, what court cases. In the United States, women or doctors who provide abortion care are going to be targeted by a
Right.
lot of these things, and stuff in certain jurisdictions. So, when I look at it in terms of in the hands of law enforcement, that is a fractionalization, a thousandfold down to the precinct level of how they are going to apply these tools. And so when you ask the question, do we want law enforcement to have it? I said no, just because I
Right.
know how, it's hard enough to keep track of how different regimes at the government level are applying these tool sets, let alone down to that precinct level of law enforcement.
Yeah.
And I asked the question
I-
if we're okay with law enforcement having this in our hands, because Juanito, you and I were at a reverse conference in Orlando, and I saw Celebrite and Magnet Forensics and these guys advertising. They're just a normal part of our everyday conference activity. They're a
Yeah.
normal part of, let's call it security community, whatever that means. It feels very much like we've separated what, the bad guys as NSO, and there's some good guys and Paragon. And the question is that where we are now, where we're just like, okay, these guys
I-
exist, they do their thing, they're a legitimate part of our ecosystem
Yeah.
because they're helping law enforcement stop terrorism or whatever they claim they stop.
I feel like I need to address that like 7 different ways. So first of all, there's a distinction. I do think it's important to draw a distinction between like Magnet Forensics, Celebrite, like the folks that are helping you do forensics collection on a device, like
Even when
that.
they're hoarding ODs?
Yeah, because well, that's where honestly I lay that at Apple's feet, because there are legitimate there is a legitimate need for the ability to forensically image and verify a device. Regardless of what you think about the cybers, like any attempt to prosecute legitimate criminality in the 21st century, where we all fucking live on our phones, is, there is something to be said about having essentially no mechanism whatsoever to forensically inspect these devices. Now, look, I'm not saying that it's in Apple, that Apple has to enable this, and I also I understand the sort of security engineering that has to go into this decision, where it's like it's not like they can only enable this for legitimate use cases. So
You're
I
asking
get
for a
it.
backdoor or what, bro?
No, I'm not asking for a backdoor. I'm saying that Apple is in a really special position because they control the hardware and the software and the subscription systems. Like they control every aspect of the identity stack involved in this, in this device in a way that no other company does. No Android, that it doesn't work that way for anyone else. So in the iOS case, yes, we have greater expectations. They also have a greater range of options, and there are things that they could be doing. Like I don't know why. Look, give me a lot of leeway. I'm not Joe Fitz, and I don't have the expertise required to genuinely come up with a solution here. But what I'm asking is, to what extent could we not have a debug, like an output only debug port, that where you can like physically just dump out all the logs and the like just a certain level of like forensic whatever, as long as the phone is unlocked. Like there's there are things in the fact that like they can verify whether the phone is unlocked in a in the way that like it normally connects to their like Apple servers. They can also verify like that the account is being accessed in this place and that place. They can also verify the integrity of the hardware, and they can also verify the integrity of the software. Like they're the only company who has some way to maybe do this in the way that Apple's magic is genuinely magic, in the way that they implement things. But it upsets me that they get such a pass, because the other part I'll put here is, I think you can insist on your walled garden as Apple, when you are genuinely providing something by virtue of that walled garden being there, which is in the App Store mentality, right? Like there's not a lot there's basically no malware as far as we know, or like genuinely bad shit on the Apple App Store. Like as far as we know, there really isn't. It's not to say that they're perfect and that the App Store is amazing or whatever, but I'm saying like that is kind of a non-issue. And they can argue, well, we control like honestly, they want it because it's like a, their cloud feudal platform where they suddenly created a multi-billion dollar marketplace that they control. But like I'm talking about the App Store. Sorry, Ryan. Like
I'm curious to know, how did my question about like us accepting these companies as normal become an Apple screed? Like
because Apple's
because
the only
Apple
one
has
we can
enabled
have.
it. You're arguing your argument is that Apple's
Sorry, you're
insistence on
right. I like went way out, but like my point here is like Celebrite and magnet forensics and whatever, and like anybody who's trying to enable this kind of visibility, and you want to look at them kind of the wrong way because they have O days. It's like I don't know. In this case, in that particular side of things, Apple has kind of created that need, and those dudes are kind of serving like a legitimate need. Whereas like I want to separate that from your Paragons, your NSOs, or whatever that are providing this lawful intercept stuff, because the the problem there is that weird misalignment of like they're a private company, but they're providing stuff for gov, but there's no verification and oversight, and they don't see who the victims are, but they are providing all the infrastructure and whatever. Like it puts it in such an awkward state of incentives that it almost only guarantees that you're going to have a bad time, as opposed to Azimuth selling O days directly to Five Eyes, and you're like, well, that all falls under whatever oversight Five Eyes has for their ops. Like you're talking about government responsibility monolithically there.
Yeah, it just feels like we've normalized acceptances of these companies. I remember when Chris Shagoyan used to come to our conferences and say, "Keep these cowboys away from our industry. Don't have them speaking at our conferences." Now they're sponsoring happy hours at our conferences, and it's just a normal part of it. And as Juanito says, it's an important part of it.
So
Where is Chris
something
Shogoyan, by the way?
He's working in Congress for the senator. He's
Wyden, he's
Senator
on
Wyden,
Wyden's
correct?
staff. But so I do want to say something um, relatively positive about Apple in this moment, because something people don't
Please.
appreciate is that without that control of hardware, operating system, software stack, um, they would not have been able to pull off the thing that allows updates to go to any mobile phone. There was no ability for any mobile cell phone carriers to pressure the ecosystem, as it were, at the time, because these updates have to go over cellular networks. Cost money to maintain. Cellular network providers are usually the first line of customer support defense if your phone gets bricked because of an update that came from the operating system manufacturer. So the fact that they had, one, well-tested hardware to work with all of their updates, and two, they had such a high market share, and everybody wanted to the carriers all wanted their phone. Remember when iPhone used to be locked to one carrier when it first
Correct.
came out?
Yeah.
Right? So they had the ability, in that power that they had at that moment, to do something no other company had been able to do. There was no ability to get updates of any kind to your phone in a regular way before Apple. So I will put that little piece in, that thank you, Apple, for letting
Yeah.
us have security updates on our phones.
No, Katie, I agree with you completely. I agree with that, and in that same exact sentiment. Like I bitch about Apple as a genuine Apple fanboy that owns almost all of their products. I own at least one of, and I'm like super excited about these things, and I shill for them all the time. I love Apple's products and stuff. And I've interviewed at Apple 5 different times and like entertained the idea. So like, like clearly, like I'm not against them as a company. It's more that I am a firm believer in like, the greater your capabilities, the greater your responsibility to leverage them. Precisely when you monopolize authorities in a way that means nobody else can have them. I don't need to be the defender of Apple's ecosystem. If Apple decides that they're going to be the fucking jackbooted assholes of the iOS defense world and be like, fuck these dudes, we're gonna pursue them, in Putin-esque, rhetoric, we will find them at the outhouse, right? Like they're gonna fuck, we're gonna go just full bore nuclear on these dudes and like go full TI and actually look for the implants and actually like look for, who is working on these things and like literally go hardcore. And you go, well, shit, like there's no room to play in this. Like we actually cannot have no visibility. There's no room for us to do shit. But those dudes have this job covered. They are doing just fine. Like if that was their approach, I don't think you would get as much complaining from the TI side. I think what scares us is that we know we are not effectively playing in it. We can tell Apple is not effectively playing in it. And the only person that seems to have anything to say and like that any ability to say anything is like a small nonprofit group out of like academia. And that's terrifying, right? Like if Bill Marsack decides that it's time to like cash in, or Ron Deibert decides to like fuck off because he's done enough, which I think is well within their rights at some point, then what happens to this? If somebody decides to stop funding this academic department, what happens to all this shit? It's like the same argument with like Bellingcat. You're like, there are too many like single points of failure for like global accountability that are not being properly funded and they're not replicated. And there's like, it's like, if this one shop, if CitizenLab goes away, if the University of Toronto decides they fucking had it, what happens?
So you are arguing that Apple should become Spider-Man. I heard some variation of the with great power comes great responsibility. I heard that in there.
That's my corporate belief system.
Right. So it's some kind of superhero arc for them. But here's the thing. It all comes down to commercial worthwhile for these companies. And it does because they will get sued by their shareholders if they do anything different. I will tell you, how did I get Microsoft to be the first company to staff a vulnerability research team that looked for third-party vulnerabilities well before Google Project Zero? How did I do that? It wasn't because Microsoft wanted to be Spider-Man. It's because when your browser crashed because of an Adobe plugin, people blamed Microsoft. When I literally saw a Linux penguin on a crash screen on an airplane entertainment system, and somebody pointed to it and said, "Damn it, Microsoft." And I'm like, that's a penguin. So they were getting blamed for everything because they had huge market share and everything. So how did I ride that angst, that commercial angst, to letting them actually do something more positive for the ecosystem as a whole? I basically said, you're getting blamed anyway. You might as well clean up the ecosystem, right, and then you'll get blamed less. And they were like, yeah, that's sure. You can do Microsoft vulnerability research, do it. So that is how you get them to give a fuck about, about opening up and doing more of this work and not having it rely on, a third party CitizenLab kind of situation. Is it has to become commercially untenable for them to continue to hold the position that they do.
Nobody's buying iPhones.
Well, exactly. Two things there. Katie's absolutely right. We clearly need a Katie Mo at Apple, right? Like that's what has not emerged.
They can't afford me. I'm just telling you.
I'm just saying, like we clearly are missing the right kind of advocacy within Apple. And I agree with you completely. I think the angle, even just like the what's in it for us angle is missing, right? Especially when what you're fighting is this notion of like, well, right now everyone assumes there's nothing wrong with us and that's great. And no one sees any friction because our devices, work pretty well. So we're good. And I think that's where you're missing a different angle, which is why I was fixating on France, which is if Apple is the security for the rich company, which it is, by global standards, we the rich are enjoying the benefits of being able to buy the most secure device on the market.
This is fact.
If the French government in particular, because they're one of the more publicly aggrieved ones, comes and makes it a fucking point to say, we want to keep buying your shit, but you are actually lowering the standard of our security because we cannot forensically analyze when one of these other countries comes and hacks all of our politicians, then there is an argument of your customers being, the rich in need of security, it's demanding to have some mechanism by which they too can verify these things. And I think, maybe it'll end up coming from things like, this whatever crypto loss from some wallet on an iOS app needed to be forensically analyzed. Otherwise, this person cannot go to court and argue that they, fraudulently lost $30 million or whatever in crypto. Maybe that's when we'll start having this getting banged on the table more. I don't know.
Costin, you still have to leave?
I have to leave. I have some wires to get removed, but I leave you in very good hands, I see.
100%.
It makes you sound like a robot.
Back to the three bodies.
The wires to get the wires removed.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like typical Friday evening. Like change the oil, remove the wires, replace.
You got 5 to 10 minutes because I wanted you in part quickly for this story on Telegram that I tried to tee up at the top. We have this Operation Zero posting and requesting, announcing they're looking for Telegram one-click, O-click, paying up to $1.5 million, up to $4 million for a full chain Telegram. Couple of things. Who are these Operation Zero people? One, and why is Telegram so valuable? Because I know you spent a couple of days looking into this Operation Zero folks who's behind it. And again, this plays into the balkanization of this thing. It's like the only official Russian zero-day purchase platform. There's some connections to the Russian government here. Help me understand what this Operation Zero is.
Well, first of all, why Telegram? I think a few days ago, Pavel Durov announced that there are over 1 billion active users of Telegram, making it the most popular social media or communications platform in the world.
It's funny how I know nobody that uses Telegram other than a handful of Europeans.
Everyone here uses Telegram. I think all my friends.
I don't get it. But it's the same people that use WhatsApp in our view, right? It's such a cultural thing.
It may be very well cultural, but also I like to think that Telegram is way more, friendly and powerful when it comes to managing groups, when it comes to managing channels, bots, all those things. Right. And I guess this is why it's become so popular now. Between 1.5 million up to $4 million for
sounds ridiculous a little bit.
I think it's well within the kind of the accepted numbers. But I think what is the most important thing here is who is the platform? Who is Operation Zero? These guys, opzero.ru, that are allegedly offering that kind of money. So, they claim to be the only official Russian zero-day purchase platform. Which is interesting.
An important word there, right?
Yeah, and they say our clients are Russian private and government organizations only. So when you sell there, there's no ambiguity. Your 0 days will go to the Russian government and some, Russian private companies, where they will be used on, I guess, Russia's adversaries. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The other one, I think, I looked a bit into the registration info for the domain, for other things, and there's a weird overlap here with a kind of a shady cryptocurrency exchange, which it calls itself Anonimaya Kryptobirja bez verifikacja, where verifikacja means literally verification. In other words, anonymous crypto exchange without verification, which further leads
on the tin
to a darknet marketplace and BTC exchange. So super shady, if you ask me. Which I was even wondering if it's some kind of a scheme to to con people into giving their exploits and essentially getting nothing?
It's
Or
not
could
new
it
though.
be?
They've been around. This
Yeah,
Operation Zero have been like fishing
sure.
for ODs in the past. I've seen it before.
Not only that, but it could also be one of these mixes of cyber criminals together with the business network, right? That is contributing in the right places, which is, I guess, how you do business in Russia nowadays. So it could very well be that as well. But I think it's my verdict is it's a shady establishment for sure. But it
So you're
may
telling
very
me that
well
I have a
have
Telegram
some
full
kind
chain, I
of
should hold on to it.
I
that's a good
mean,
question. If you have a full chain, I would expect it's not just you, but nowadays, for someone to have a full zero-click chain on Telegram with persistence, the $4 million thingy, you need a team of maybe 30 people. That's my personal estimation.
I'm
But
not
I
surprised
let you
by the
guys
price.
I let you guys discuss this, and I'm really curious. I'm gonna listen to the episode when it goes out. So thanks,
Thank you
Katie,
for
for
hanging out with
joining
us,
us,
buddy.
Dude, I didn't
and have
realize how
fun.
fucked we were. Like the one that does like all the actual homework. Like the kid in the group, like the kid in the
Mr.
group
Romania.
project, the kid in the group
Mr.
project that
Romania.
actually did all the work is going
He's
home
leaving.
early and we're all fucked for the remainder of the podcast.
I have to sing you off then. There
There
he
you go.
goes, Mr. Romania.
Picture.
And
you.
he's at
Take care,
least giving
buddy.
us
Thank
the
you.
princess wave. Thank
Yeah.
you for
Do
that.
look into a song from the KLF, in which there's like, by the way, chorus and America. Look into
This
this.
our
I
most
told you this was the
musical
musical
episode.
episode. I
Yeah.
told you.
Jeez,
Yeah.
what is going
I-
on?
Dude,
Costin,
I
best
have
of
to
luck with your procedure. Hopefully, you get that stuff removed easily.
get all your wires uncrossed. I am actually not surprised at the value of this zero click. I don't even think that it's necessarily like an illegitimate thing because I don't think that they're overcharging for it. I think you have to understand why this is valuable and to whom in that space. Like the people in Russia whom are powerful and have money are obsessed with who the fuck these random semi-anonymous accounts are that run um, journalistic groups that like put out videos and coverage of stuff inside of Russia.
A lot of the war coverage out
like
of Ukraine is happening
a
on
lot of
Telegram
the
as well.
work there's so much of what's happening of like targeting, like even if you wanted like enablement ops on like figuring out who like these key figures in Ukraine are that are communicating all this stuff, like literally finding Ukrainian soldiers and where they are. Like there are so many ways in which what Telegram is providing that, let's say, Signal fails to provide is this like disconnect between the identity and like the identity of this like account in this mobile platform that includes a whole lot of like, as you said, sort of group management functions and whatnot, and the like actual persona, like the fact that you can have these multiple accounts, you can have them like not be directly tied, you can have contact like linking, but you don't necessarily need to have it. Like it gives you just enough to have like a slight throwawayness or distance between me as an individual and me as like my Telegram persona that is managing all these group chats and whatnot. So like the more I think about it, the more I realize like why this is genuinely valuable. It's not something that you would get from your iOS full chain, even if you have it, because in order to leverage that iOS full chain, you need to know the phone number or who this person is. Whereas in this case, what they want is to know who these accounts actually belong to and who it is that's doing what, and they have no way to tie it otherwise.
Is it fair that every country has their own kind of zero-day purchasing platform and that itself has become balkanized, including bug bounty programs? Like I assume every country has their own kind of bug bounty programs where they're kind of trying to get good bugs from their own internal researchers. Is that something that also gets balkanized or is already there?
Well, I mean, country, but this was your way of calling on me without calling on me.
No,
I
no,
think.
no,
I
no.
was
I
gonna
didn't say
talk, and
I
I'm
didn't say
like, I
anything.
would
I
be a
just
fucking idiot to jump in on this one
No,
first. Like,
so I mean, your bug bounty programs are, supposed to be used for defensive purposes only, right? So what you're asking for is an offense bug purchasing program, which is not, if we're going to slice the terminology here, that's
right,
not
right.
bug bounty, right? Um, and do I think that countries have these programs going on? Absolutely. That is honestly, that's where all of this started. It wasn't originally with like full chain exploits necessarily. It was with individual vulnerabilities that could then be, further refined, right? It's the raw ore of vulnerabilities that gets further refined into this beautiful watch, and beautiful piece of jewelry that is a full chain exploit. Um, but I think, to your point is don't countries already have this? Yes, absolutely. And not only do they have this, but it was the United States government that actually started jacking up the prices in terms of market value. Who is responsible? It's our outsized defense budget, where we were literally outspending everybody in every other category. So why not bugs, right?
right.
I remember having a conversation with some of our counterparts, and I won't say which country, but I remember them saying, "Is there anything you can do about the U.S. government jacking up the prices? Because it's getting pricey for us over here. We don't have your budget." And
Interesting.
so,
Wow.
yeah, absolutely. So, yes, that has been going on since time immemorial of buying bugs. But I don't know that is going to end anytime soon. And I think that it's also something where it's the ability to refine that raw ore of vulnerabilities into something exploitable. That's always been the lever that mattered, right? It matters more in defense, it matters more in offense. As you two know this about me, I had done some academic research back in the day on the vulnerability economy and exploit market, and we were trying to determine, is price the best lever to tip the scales between offense and defense? And the answer was no, it's not price, because the offense market can always outspend the defense market.
Right.
Why is that? Because the defense market has to account for recruiting and salaries and kind of maintaining the preventative
Mhm.
folks, right? So if you made it so pricey to spend for defense, who would ever, attend their annual performance review as an employee ever again? Nobody, right? Like I wouldn't. If the defensive market got to a certain point where it was trying to compete with the offense market, that would be a big mistake.
Mhm.
But what was the real lever? It was determining exploitability. So you can have your fuzzers find your crashes, but that refinement process of the raw ore of a bug into
Mhm.
a full chain exploit, the real lever that tips the scale is the ability to quickly identify exploitable crashes and then further refine those. So that, I mean, who knows? Somebody might read my research from a decade ago and realize like that's the place that we should be investing, or maybe not. Maybe we'll just wait for some men to stumble upon the same conclusion and then it will take off. So yeah.
Just
There's
I hadn't realized that one of the new uses for generative AI is to just maybe automate the process of rewriting a woman's brilliant ideas into a
Oh yeah.
man's
Oh
much
my
more
goodness.
like sellable package, right? The investable package that can get some VC exposure. Uh, it's really interesting to hear this, in part because, right, like I may be misrepresenting your point, but in a way, if we can kind of bastardize that narrative, part of the problem is almost like you have this roster of like well-paid mercs in the offense side, and like there has been that ratcheting up. You and then you have us very like calmly salaried defense nerds, which it's not just about whether we're getting paid like football players, but rather you have a very limited subset of defense, like truly high end defensive talent, and they're bogged down in being full-time employees of one company or another company and not actually playing in a more life and tactical sort of way, which is like me doing a very self-serving reading of what you're suggesting, or like what you're explaining about that market as well.
Right, and the exploitability point is an important one because as the Operation Zero folks say here, they're not buying vulnerabilities, right? The offensive guys are buying full-fledged exploits. So there's a big distinction between those two things. Sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, there is a big distinction between those two things. But I will also say that one of the other outcomes of the research that I had done long ago was looking at who the players are and how long they stay active at that very high level. So what you're saying, there is a limited number. Guess what? That limited number stays about the same, even though the population of the Earth grows, even though the knowledge dissemination in our industry increases and spreads. The reason why that population of the super elite, who are capable of doing this kind of work stays about the same is because there's a technology arc of being viable in that space for as long as you're basically willing to keep up with emerging defenses. And since that technology arc moves at a certain pace, you're basically it's not just age that makes people, stop doing this work. You will just see the technology moving. So if you look at hacker generations, generations of hackers, kind of coming up, they're probably about like 3 years apart. Human generations, roughly like 20 years apart. Hacker generations are approximately 3 years apart. Why? Because those are the earmarks of major defensive advancements. That's about the pace of major mitigation categories, that then sort of push out
3 years? Is that short cycle now?
You really need to write a paper with this stuff. Like, this is like, frankly, we talk about this bullshit like every week, and this might be some of the most you're kind of like putting it out there in an extremely casual way, but this may be the more substantive discussion of sort of the underlying paradigm of what the organizational aspects of this are, and sort of that I've ever have not read and have yet to hear. And so sorry, I don't want to cut you off to tell you how valuable what you're saying is, but I am kind of I'm reeling a little bit as we think about this one, because I just assumed there was there can only be so many midichlorians sort of spread around humanity at any given moment to produce hackers that are actually capable of doing these full chains. And it's very specific people doing iOS full chains, or who have ever done an iOS full chain, who made me appreciate the true complexity of it. I assumed it was playing, the same. It's okay, yeah, exploits are hard, but if you're good at exploits, I'm sure you'll find an exploit. It's yeah, not anymore, right? Not with something like iOS, or as Costin said before he left, right? Oh, this Telegram full chain 0-click thingy must be 30 people, and you're okay, let's talk about that, right? There is something to be said about how much you pay for a product that it took 30 fucking people to make. And in talking about $1 million or $2 million is not out of the realm. It's not outlandish. It's actually commensurate in some way.
I had a lot of incoming and pushback last week from folks who listened to the episode and was very upset that we skipped over the CISA edition. Juanito's favorite segment.
All right.
I'm taking this fucking flag off, man. Sorry, guys. Sorry, I'm
and I want to touch on some of the things from last week that we didn't get to, because I think it's important. One, the Sean Planky nomination is official for head of CISA. Anyone knows anything about this guy? What the expectations are? Are we optimistic, pessimistic? What is the general feeling?
I mean, are we going to see his calendar? Because that's
another thing. I have it on my note here. They actually published Jen Easterley's calendar. Which, I mean, in theory, you want all your government officials to be accountable in this way of how they're spending government time. I get the...
Was this a So wait, what I wanted to know was, is this a normal disclosure? This happens every time a director leaves? Or was this a targeted...
I've never seen it before.
Yeah.
I've never seen it, but I've never looked. I
True.
never
I
noticed,
mean,
right?
I
So,
thought that, like, for example, like presidential calendars and stuff like
yeah.
that used to have a certain level of transparency. Obviously, you're not going to tell people where the president is going to be for tactical reasons, but like, I do think there's a certain amount of in the old guard, in the world with rules. When we were all playing pretend, there was a certain amount of encouraged transparency as to like this is how your public officials spend their time. I don't know if that's what's happening here, right?
And
Like,
if
I'm
it's
not trying to be
deliberate, what's the point?
naive. Yeah. Well, I think the obvious point would be to promote that narrative that, substantiated or not, and I think, we're all going to be all over the spectrum on this one, about how Jen spent her time and her prioritization. I I don't know that you're actually, like, having looked through some of the calendars and having had deep research go through some of the calendars, like, I think you can substantiate any narrative you want on the basis of those calendars. You can come out and say, "Oh, she did so much PR," and you can come out and say, "Oh, she did so much work," like for all of these different hot topics that you would want a director to be involved in. So, like, I personally, I think it's a nothing burger, but it's the kind of nothing burger that you give people who need just a crumb of substantiation to say whatever the fuck they want about this person.
They're reporting that CISA cut annual budgets from some ISAC funding for the states. We have on this podcast complained bitterly about CISA's budget and the fact that they spend $3-4 billion a year. What do we get for that? What's the ROI? What's the ROI? We're starting to see cuts now. Should we accept that these cuts are a normal part of it, or are we nervous that these cuts are happening in places where they can't really be tolerated because of the value of whatever was being funded? How are we feeling about the reporting on some of the CISA cuts?
Well, I mean, from my perspective, who's going to fill those gaps at the local levels, right? Who they had stepped in and they were providing that funding. I mean, this goes across the board for all the federal funding cuts. Like who at the state and local level is filling those gaps? And there's some in the election infrastructure support, which makes you kind of wonder why that particular cut would be happening. But I mean, I think that we will have to see what tries to kind of fill in these gaps at the local level. Honestly, I think for a long time, well before CISA existed, well before the government was aware of their potential role in, establishing cybersecurity across, critical infrastructure and all the other local areas, well before they existed, it kind of fell to private companies to step in and try and offer some support and help,
Right.
So we might see some offers of support from the mega companies that already do so, but they might have to step it up and increase their giving.
I think in this case, like Ryan, particularly when it comes to like the international listeners, like there is a mismatch in just expectations and understanding, but I think that mismatch also applies to Americans right now because we have massive whiplash at
A
how
mismatch of what?
quickly
I'm not following.
a mismatch of expectations because of this whiplash we're experiencing at how quickly our government has shifted to a completely different style of economic policy, whether you agree with it or not. Like it doesn't. Like, I'm not saying I'm for it. I'm not even going to say whether I'm for or against it. Not out of waffling, but just out of like we need to kind of understand what it looks like. Period. For as long as I've been alive, the US government had this notion of just like soft power being important, both internally and, well, actually, mostly externally.
Yeah,
And
Voice of
then
America and some of the things we've talked
yeah,
about on the podcast, right? Some
we
of the
were willing
problems.
to
Yeah.
invest into some of that stuff. And honestly, we kind of really neglected a lot of funding these kinds of initiatives internally, in part because of the way our government is designed, where you have this separation between state, local and federal, and there is actually some discouragement of like stepping on the turf of the states. So it was very difficult to um, to have a consistent standard across different parts of the United States. It was very difficult to have the same technology stacks. Like defending the US is hard, maybe harder than a lot of other countries, not just because of its size, but also because of the diversity of ecosystems that are created sort of within there, and the lack of levers to effectively, that notion that like someone can just come down the mountain and tell every state what to do and every organization what to do because by God, this is the US government. Like that doesn't really account for the reality of how US government sort of functions. So this kind of thing, I think, may have been one of the more valuable efforts, on the part of CISA as a vehicle to fund things that normally are not being coordinated, normally are not being supported, and frankly, doing so to a paltry tune. Like they should have been. Ideally, this may have been one of the areas where they could have done more had they put more of their funding of just saying, look, we're serving as a vehicle for Congress to pass funds onto the states and onto particular verticals that are of like critical importance to the US. So like instead of burning that money on bullshit, like buying appliances and devices that you weren't really using, stuff like that, you could have been funding this more. So like that's where we get into this awkward situation where I'm like, I no longer want to criticize CISA because we're in such a like weird state now where it's like we've decided to sit it all out. But this is one where I'm like, if I have any criticism, it's that I kind of would have liked to see this funded more rather than less. With the assumption that these ISACs are doing something good, with the assumption that they're well run, with the assumption that they are actually serving in the interest that they claim to serve, to say this may have been one of the only vehicles by which the federal government was actually supporting some of these smaller organizations, and that's no longer going to be the case from the looks of it.
No, and
Right.
I will agree with you on that. It was a form of preventative medicine, and it's actually going to cost us a lot more, and it will cost the US government a lot more in terms of ER care as a result of not having
Right.
a lot of this preventative medicine in the, out there in the more local ecosystem. So absolutely they should have invested more and done more with it. But we are in the reality that we're in right now, and we're going to have to make do and figure out how to get by. But I don't know that there's any other besides the mega corporations, the private companies. There's no other entity that has enough resources and enough reach to be able to step in and try to fill that void. And I know that from like just taking the one piece of election security, there are prohibitions on how much private companies are allowed to donate by, FEC jail is real jail, as they say in political donations, right? And so they can't break certain laws in terms of, how much they donate, in terms of services, in terms of software, any kind of, EDR software or whatever it is that they
Right.
might, be willing to donate. They literally can't. There's a limit. And so the way that CISA was helping in this was that, one, it was providing government funding, which it's not the same as a private company donating, right? In terms of violating, rules for governing elections and governing political activities and everything. And we're going to have to see how that void is filled.
Shouldn't we
Or
have
if it
heard
is.
from Sean Planky by now? I mean, we criticized Jen for too much PR. It feels like we're not getting anything at all official. We're getting a lot of this hodgepodge reporting on cuts. Like even this story, it's a 10 million cut from the Center for Internet Security that was handling some cyber threat intelligence,
Or
cyber
the red
incident
team is cut,
response.
the red team is not cut,
The
like
red team,
that
exactly.
whole thing,
Yeah.
It
Right.
feels like we're not hearing from Sean Planky. Is that something we should expect by now?
I don't know
Or
if
do we wait for his
it's
nomination to get cleared and finalized?
well, I mean, that is a part of it, right? You're not going to hear from him before like he's fully settled in, and it's taken a bit to like get him in place. But then the other part of it is like, how much are you hearing from a lot of the U.S. government, considering that this is a time of like centralized forces coming into other
Right.
parts of the government to tell you whether you even have a job anymore, whether you even have a budget anymore. So like it's also like how much autonomy is Sean Planky going to have? How much does he actually know? how much money he's going to have. Like, is
But
this
outside
suddenly
of
going to become a like, oh, yeah, welcome. Yes, you are the director of CISA. Also, now CISA has been gutted. It no longer exists. Thank you, Sean. Let's get out of here. Right. Like, is that kind of what we're waiting for? Or
No, I
like,
think outside of election security, cybersecurity has been bipartisan for the most part. I mean, if it affects you, it affects me. If your phone can be popped, my phone can be popped. There's a general feeling that cybersecurity and protecting the homeland from cybersecurity is a
but
bipartisan
nothing,
thing.
what rules still apply, bro? Like, what, that's all pre schism thinking. Like, we are literally cutting things. Like, we're gutting the Department of Education as of yesterday. So
Yeah.
like, I just don't like, yes, sure, bipartisan, whatever, but it was all in the fabric of the previous way of doing things. And look, let's take this a different direction, right? Let's talk about it more in sort of this thought experiment where let's just assume CISA is going away. Let's just assume that the US government has decided it will no longer try to fund cybersecurity down in the state, local, et cetera levels, and they're just kind of let everybody fend for themselves. I think there's as many
Many.
many narratives right now seem to fall on this notion of like laissez-faire, like free market is gonna step in to like fix shit. I think what we're being told is that there's an expectation that somehow a great many SMB companies are gonna pop up that are going to be aligned, capable, trained, able to provide the services that all these sort of places need at adequate rates, and somehow things are going to just magically fit together. I don't know that sounds likely. I also don't know that anyone of those companies was in a position like a 50-person manufacturing company or whatever that's central to national security, but it's still a 50-person company in like Wyoming making parts for planes or whatever. It's still not any more positioned to get some cybersecurity package or whatever. And now you're talking about the general line just like continuing to drop, and the same threats from before that were already kind of overwhelming us being in a much better position to like go on the ransomware epidemic of the century and be like, who are you going to call? Literally fucking no one, because there's just literally no one to call.
Now I can tell you this is effectively an abdication of the duty to serve the best interest of the country, because it's, to your point, these SMBs are not going to materialize, the
They're not
capabilities.
coming.
And frankly, it's akin to, expecting individual municipalities and critical infrastructure to fabricate from the ground up their own iron domes. It is like that level of, and
Right.
you might have been able to have
Right.
them learn how to do this 15, 17, 20 years ago, but the threats have evolved, the sophistication that they're up against has evolved, and if they are, if they're in the blast radius of being a viable target or even a target of opportunity, they're going down.
Right.
And CISA was not even able to meet that need with the funding level that it had.
Right.
I remember when CISA's funding level looked comparable to Microsoft's funding level in terms of what they were actually funded for security wise. And it was ridiculous. I mean, CISA got more money, still completely inadequate for the
Right.
mission that they had. And now it seems like they are deliberately shrinking their mission. And I mean, I don't know how much longer we want to spend on CISA in particular, but when you said, Ryan, about, cybersecurity should be bipartisan, and you were saying, Jags, that, this is from the old way of thinking, and everything's out the window now, and anything goes. I will tell you, as a former member of a CISA advisory board, not only was it's not even that partisanship ever came into the conversation as part of the Cyber Safety Review Board. It was nonpartisan. It was
Correct.
anti-partisan. There was no conversation at all about politics in what we were doing. And the fact that, a lot of those advisory boards, had just been dropped and everything, I, of course, had rolled off last year. So I wasn't one of the ones who was pink slipped suddenly. But to me, it was very strange that they made those cuts when those boards cost nothing. They're not paid, and whatnot. They cost zero. And there was never a political conversation ever in,
This is my point.
in
Yeah.
yeah.
It,
So anyway, we are operating in a totally different world that
yeah.
doesn't assume none of the rules prior
Yeah.
apply.
There's a reason I mentioned sort of like to our European and like global listeners, right? Like you are missing out. I think it's going to be hard for them. Like it was already hard to understand the way the US functioned before, just out of like it's like weird, just weird way of going about things. But you're also like if you're expecting to see more of the same, if anything that you were using as a substantiation back in the day of like, well, surely they would never, you're like, no, that shit is all gone, it's all out the window. So like the discussion now is like, okay, if the government were to be a complete non-entity in defense, what are we looking at? And I'll tell
We're
you
looking at
this, like,
California. We're looking at California, fifth largest
right,
economy in the world.
right.
California is going to have to step in and fill this void. Now, I'm almost serious, right? But no, to your point
Yeah,
about the fact that the world doesn't understand how we operate, when I had to go help renegotiate the Wassenaar arrangement, right, the export controls around intrusion software technology, one of the main arguments from our global counterparts in the Wassenaar process was, why can't you just, and they kind of applied their own
right.
much smaller view, much smaller country, much smaller market. They were able to solve all the problems that we cannot solve because of our size and scale. And quite frankly, like, yeah, I said California, but it's not I mean, I'm saying that to draw the attention of the fact that California literally is the fifth largest economy in the world.
Right.
Like it outpaces other countries and everything.
Yeah.
And we don't often appreciate the fact that we have this big complex problem to solve, and we have a wealth and a tax of having so many technology companies actually based here, that it is a
Yeah.
very complex problem.
I think that brings us to like, look, that brings up a whole lot of points, and maybe this is when we start like just going straight into politics and diverging entirely from cyber. But but considering that it's still in the tech sector, I will say it is the fifth largest economy in large part on the basis of the same people who are heavily invested and involved in the decision making right now into the sort of monetary policies that we're getting into. And what I would like to say is like, at previous times that you like to point to as to how the government could have operated and backed off and whatever, and like this golden age of like robber barons, those people knew to reinvest their money back where they live so that people don't tear them to fucking shreds. There is in this like valley disconnect autistic bullshit where they seem to think that life is just gonna inevitably continue to shine in their favor no matter how much they spit on the people around them. Now, landing that a little more realistically into security, I do think that there is a big market failure here when it comes to our ability to respond to the need that's coming up right now. And it's part of one of like my favorite picadillos, or like always argue about this, but like the security industry is extremely consolidated, right? Like Google just picked up Wiz. Yet another thing has like gotten sort of absorbed, and like the Wiz people are very happy. I hear that the Israeli startup market is very jazzed, as you can expect. But like, guys, like this keeps getting more and more and more consolidated into companies that only care about deals that are like in the 8-figure range. GCP, Google Cloud, Mandiant, etc., who like I love them, I support them, but like their interest is in cutting deals of 7 and 8-figure upsells so that they can show commensurate returns to a cloud offering. And the same is happening at Microsoft, and the same is happening at all these other places. And you go, look, it's not that I need the government to come in and defend these companies. But if the idea is that the market is going to adjust, has anyone given that memo to like basically 10 players in the security offerings space to maybe offer something that is accessible to a small business? Like for any of our companies, for any of Microsoft's offerings, like walk in the door and be like, yo, I'm gonna just need 25 licenses, just 25 seats from my little shop over here. They're like, bro, we don't need the paperwork it takes to sell this is not worth our time. Fuck off.
Yeah.
And you go, so what is this thing? Like what is the business model I think I'm enabling? Because I think we need to like all sit down and have a big like market mechanics conversation right now of saying, if what we're expecting is that a bunch of like MSSPs are going to suddenly pop up that are like local and regional, and they're going to come and like package security from like deals they have with Microsoft, like to be a reseller of Microsoft, SentinelOne, CrowdStrike, Palo Alto, like all the like Fortinet, every fucking company, and then offer you something that is not priced or properly spec'd for small companies. Like it just, this shit does not make sense right now. And
No,
like,
I'm going to tell you how
right.
this happened. This is called unchecked capitalism, and you're describing the Walmartization, just basically pushing out the ability for small local businesses to even get established. I, as a small business owner, can tell you that it is absolutely impossible to compete with basically folks who can afford to price down their offerings to the point where they are not offering anything in terms of the actual value of what it costs to create, to maintain, to even sell what they're selling. But they're doing it to grab market share. I mean, this is the playbook that has been in place with, all of the major companies that have been coming into play in the last 15 years. And you've also seen a concentration of wealth and growth and monopolization in individuals, their individual growth. The billionaires have gotten billionaire, right? and the and these companies have gone like mega, multiples over their original market caps just a few years ago. I mean, just even in the pandemic alone, remember we thought, oh, there's this economic downturn because the pandemic. No, we saw record profits and labor cuts, right? So we saw all of these things where it's unchecked capitalism. So what you're describing is the Walmartization, the pushing out of the mom and pops, and the inability for the consumers to, one, get something that's right sized for them and that's actually helping to solve a security problem. Yeah. Now, when I say unchecked capitalism, who's supposed to balance this out? It's supposed to be regulation. Well, we don't have that here on that front in the United States anymore. If we look to our global counterparts and hope, like you were saying, you've got some hope in France or in Europe to help regulate the companies into doing things. Well, they'll just do it for that market. They won't do it for us. And so we're still a little bit stuck.
I think the only reason I look to the Europeans is the fact that like the Europeans are suffering a different Achilles heel, which is it's like a different side of the exact same coin, which is they do not compete. They have no companies of their own that do any of this shit. Like there are, the other day I was like talking to someone and they're like, well, there are no European AI companies, like not frontier model, like not actually like bleeding edge doing their own shit. There are none. And I was like, yeah, there also are no cloud companies, right? Like which is why like all of our discussions of data sovereignty, like they were always kind of hilarious because you're like, oh, the Europeans are going to demand this and that. We're like, yeah, but they have to demand it because the only providers are American companies, and American companies are entertaining them because they want to still be able to make money off of the European government. But if they decided to just be like, well, fuck you, like what are they going to do?
They don't say fuck you. They comply within that country. So in the data centers of the cloud data centers that are housed in that country, they comply with the laws in that country. That's why I'm saying we don't get any benefit of that. Correct. Because it's Wild West over here, without the regulations applying over here, they're not going to apply them. I remember doing I remember doing a security audit of a global construction company that was based in the United States, and they had to comply with European privacy law. So they had a switch where they could just turn it on and off, and they just turned it on in Europe, and they didn't turn it on in the United States. And it was like,
Comply.
it was a global construction company, like physical construction, and you could search in any employee, including contractors, could search the time card application for a name of a country and then suddenly find all of the employees by name and local address in that country. So imagine searching for Iraq and but and just finding who's in Iraq and everything.
Right.
In Europe, you couldn't do that because they had a switch, right? And they only
Right.
turned that switch on in Europe.
I just have two thoughts on Juanito's leaning on Europe. Is that Europe is not monolithic either. We have the Brits turning off Apple's encrypted backups.
I'm sorry, that's not Europe. That is just an island the size of
They voted to
Nantucket,
not be Europe.
conveniently floating near the continent.
That's what I'm
of
saying. So
Europe.
leaning on Europe at a time when they're breaking norms around what is accepted security is not necessarily the most ideal thing. And then the second thing we do get, the only thing I get out of Europe is clicking on GDPR.
Oh, the fucking cookies.
Cookies.
No, well, look, my point is simply that look, with this conversation and with the one about what was it, the mercenary spyware in Apple and whatever, all I've been talking about is someone setting a standard. I am not thinking that anybody's got
You're looking for leadership somewhere.
Well, yeah, I want leadership somewhere just for the sake of raising the bar. However, that seems extremely lofty given the conversation we were just having, where it's like, if anything, we're just kind of putting the bar on the floor and saying, let's see who picks it up. And what it makes me wonder is to what extent what we're fostering in this Wild West is the opening for the Pinkertons. Like, where is the privatized defense industry coming from? And what's it going to look like? Because I'll tell you this, the regulation, I've always bitched about regulation in the sense that I kind of want it on one hand and I resent it on the other, because I want it to come in to pressure the huge companies that have no responsiveness to a market because they don't give a fuck because their money comes from somewhere else. And I resent it when it limits what could be appearing in a smaller, in the smaller scale, like companies that have no way of sort of competing or doing. Because what I'm saying here is if we're going to have an equivalent of Pinkertons, if we're going to have an equivalent of a privatized security offering, well, part of what never let that happen was a fear of this DOJ that looks at you using a leaked username and password to an account you don't own as a CFAA violation, regardless of its context. And no stare decisis, no background of cases that you can point to of saying, hey, this is good faith security offering or research or whatever. And conversations about hacking back literally having first of all, hacking back never made any fucking sense in the first place. And second, the solution to it is to look at how we privatized piracy back in the day. You're like, dude, the whole conversation is just being had on fucking dumbass terms. And you're like, okay, so it is the idea of allowing the market to fill the need coming hand in hand with DOJ also stepping out and being like, guys, all bets are off. You guys want to ransomware companies in Russia? Knock yourselves out. We don't give a fuck anymore. If that's what's happening, shit's about to get super interesting. Super, super, super interesting. But that, you need that determination. You need them to come out proactively and say, we will not be prosecuting anybody that does anything that's targeting companies outside of the US, or we will not be anybody who's acting in the defense of a US company. Knock yourselves out. We will not be prosecuting you in any way. If they come out and say that, then shit is about to get wild out here.
Let's leave it right there. Just quickly, Juan, just to close the loop on all the CISA and CISA cuts and so on. Have you heard or seen any cut that's been that effectively marginalized and broken things? Because I see the Kev list is still going. There's a lot of output out of CISA continuing. And then the reporting has been kind of murky. The red team is laid off. The red team is not laid off. Have you heard or seen any sort of big layoffs, cuts that has affected something significant? Not really.
No, I mean, you asking me or
Yes,
like I think
because you're more in that world, in your Washington D.C. world. Is there a cut there that you see?
I don't want to say I don't think specific to CISA, because to me CISA's like the useful part of CISA was always hidden from view, is the one that does defend stuff for the government internally. And people within Gov would always be like, yo, chill on CISA, because they do offer certain things to Gov that are really important but that don't get talked about. And I think that's
Right.
part of like the mistake in some of the messaging and being so outward, is that you were never going to be able to actually give people much of anything publicly unless you leaned in on like, oh, we're open source tools. I don't know, whatever the fuck it is that you could provide for free, which is not what they were doing. But a lot of the value was in places that we wouldn't see, and I'm not sure how those places are faring. What I will say is I'm hearing from like the things I'm hearing of cuts in the IC are genuinely worrying, because they're being done in what sound like so sweeping and careless ways, including like the discussion of like DEI and whatever, because these over bureaucratized intelligence agencies were relying on like shortcuts and cheats around the bureaucracy in order to retain really high-end talent. So something that I've heard about is like there were folks that were being kept on like, you just came back from a rotation to the Middle East, and the only billet that was available in like that unit that you used to serve at that they want you at was a DEI billet, and you're like, oh, okay, yeah, I'll just go into the DEI job. And the next thing you know, like one of the most talented people in that team who you were dying to retain, who you cannot easily replace, who you cannot afford to rehire, got cut summarily. And you're like, fuck, like this does not sound like efficiency. This sounds like we're really dismantling talent in sweeping broad ways that I have no idea how USG is going to be able to like recover from. Because the minute you take that specialized talent, it was already hard to convince them to work for
the government,
next to nothing that they could be making in the private sector. Not smoke weed. Like you're constant, you can't travel, you're constantly living with this like all these horrible constraints. And now like you're getting summarily, you're having this thing like taken away from you, which was security, like the feeling that you could have a mission and you wouldn't feel fucked with like every 2 years, like some Google executive suddenly decides they're going to cut 15,000 people and like you're out on the street overnight. You're taking that away. I just don't see how we expect to restaff these capabilities in those important pockets that are not subject to like just being spun out as a third party. Like that's my one fear.
We can't restaff them, even if we tried to hire them all back today, we can't. We can't get them all back. But I will tell you what happened in the previous administration of this flavor. Things went on pause, cybersecurity wise, at the federal level. Like when the last administration came back in, they took a look and they literally saw like no forward momentum, no movement. I think what we have here with all these cuts is going to be a regression, and it's not just going to affect the United States, it's already affecting our international partners, and in more ways than just cutting, intelligence from Ukrainian operations and things like that. It is the fact that our government can't necessarily have as many secrets shared with it as it entertained in the past. That is cutting. It's basically a downward spiral that happened very, very, very quickly. It's like a sepsis, and I am worried about, our global organ failure in cybersecurity as a result of this. And so not to leave it on such a gross
I was just going to say, on that note.
No, we can't leave it on this gross note. I just want to thank you all for having me as your extra buddy on Three
Absolutely.
Buddies.
Come on.
I
We made you
definitely
wake
want.
up at an ungodly hour for
I know,
this.
and I pretended to brush my hair. So everyone who watches the YouTube will be like, she didn't do that. She did not.
Before we go, we always close the show with shout outs and
Okay.
plugs. Hey, do you have any shout outs you want to give
Well,
to
let me
folks
think
in the
about it.
audience?
You do me last.
Juanito,
Damn it! I never
he's never
prepare for this.
prepared.
No, I'm never prepared across the board. So shout out to actually to a lot of sort of the European partners who are trying to figure their shit out. I actually had some really interesting conversations very recently with folks who are suddenly having to get very real and pragmatic, and the rug has been pulled out from under their feet. And in this case, I'm actually excited for what it might do, because I do think that a lot of our European friends, you would see some really great people fighting some very difficult, like bureaucratic inertia, and they just could not get momentum into saying, hey, like we need to talk to private partners. Hey, we need to be sharing more information. Hey, we probably need to be declassifying some stuff. Like they were fighting and fighting and fighting and having a rough time. So all of a sudden, I mean, for better or worse, they suddenly have a much stronger, pillar to stand on of saying, hey, we need to figure this shit out for ourselves, because the global order has been dismantled and is changing. So shout out to them. Super excited to see what can come out of that side. Like right now, I think I have a lot of optimism for like need breeding, opportunity breeding, ingenuity, and us. Like, we're hackers at the end of the day. We got to come together and figure out what the right solution is going to be for our space, regardless of what's happening in meat space.
Thank you. From my side, shout out to the folks at CISA holding down the fort. They're continuing to do good work. There are a lot of vendors relying on CISA data to feed stuff into their vulnerability portals, into flagging things for people to know when things are exploited and kind of updating.
Shout out to folks at the fort for holding down the fort.
Shout out to all those guys. And Katie, you get the last word.
No, you gave the shouts to all the right people. It's the people who are left holding the bag. It's the people who are still trying to do their jobs with fewer resources. And that doesn't just apply to, all the government cuts. It applies to all the nonprofits that got their grants cut. It applies to, every single organization that is feeling the pressure right here. So, we've got Mr. America, but we also we have a global panoply of superheroes, and they're all out there, and they're all trying to make the best of the current situation. And our industry shouldn't rely so much on superheroes. Is how I would leave it. We should have better support, and we should have better ability to grow our own infrastructure, and capabilities and everything. And until we do, thanks to those heroes.
That's a much better place to leave it. Katie Moussouris, thank you very much for joining us. There's always a chair here for you. Whenever you feel you have something to say and you want to join the show, you're always welcome here.
Thank you. I'm a little sad we didn't get to the Chinese robot topic.
Chinese robot.
There's always a bunch of leftover stories. We're 2 hours in and I gotta run. So
right, exactly.
Thank you guys.